In October of 1974, at a farm liquidation sale outside of Grundy Center, Iowa, a 31-year-old woman named Nora Reinhardt paid $45 for a 1952 Oliver 88 that hadn't moved under its own power in 11 years. The front tires were flat and cracked through to the cords. The hood was gone, stripped off by someone who'd needed the hinges for something else, and never came back for the rest. The fuel tank had a split along the bottom seam that someone had patched with a strip of inner tube and a hose clamp, and the patch had failed, and the tank had rusted through from the inside out. There was a bird's nest in the air cleaner housing. The rear drawbar was bent at an angle that suggested the previous owner had tried to pull something that didn't want to move and had found out why. The auctioneer, a man named Gerald Foss, who had been calling sales in Grundy County for 22 years, paused when he reached that lot. He looked at his clipboard. He looked at the tractor. He said, as close to an apology as a man in his position could manage, "This one's for parts, or for someone with more ambition than sense, and we'll start the bidding at $20. A scrap dealer from Rhinebeck bid $20. A younger man bid $25, looked at it again and stepped back. Nora bid $45. Gerald Foss looked at her for a moment, said $45 once, said $45 twice, said sold, and moved on to the next lot before anyone could say anything. Her brother-in-law, Dale Reinhardt, who had driven her to the sale and was standing 6 feet to her left, said, "Nora, what in the world are you going to do with this thing? She said she'd figure it out." The story traveled the way all stories travel in small farming counties. From the sale itself to the feed store in Grundy Center by Monday morning. From the feed store to the co-op elevator by Tuesday. From the co-op to the Grundy County diner by Wednesday noon. From the diner to the parking lot of Zion Lutheran by Sunday. By the time the story reached the church parking lot, it had acquired details that weren't in the original. She'd paid $60. She'd paid $80. She'd paid $100. The tractor didn't have an engine at all. The tractor didn't have rear wheels. She'd had to have it towed home behind a borrowed truck. The laughter was not mean-spirited, not exactly. It was the laughter of a community that had decided collectively and without much deliberation that a 31-year-old woman farming 240 acres alone had made a foolish purchase, and that the foolish purchase confirmed something they had already half believed. They laughed for about 4 months. They stopped laughing in the spring of 1975, when Nora Reinhardt pulled that Oliver 88 out of the machine shed under its own power and drove it the length of her south field at a pace that made her neighbor Leroy Voss stop his own tractor, climb down, and walk to the fence line to watch. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Nora Reinhardt, because what she did with that tractor and what she did with the money she saved because of it only makes sense if you understand who she was and where she came from. Nora May Reinhardt, née Brandt, was born in 1943 on a 240-acre farm 2 miles east of Grundy Center in Grundy County, Iowa. Her father was Harold Brandt. Harold Brandt was a machinist by training and a farmer by inheritance, and he was the kind of man who treated those two things as one thing, because to him, they were. He had apprenticed at a machine shop in Waterloo before the war, come home with a working knowledge of lathes and mills and surface grinders, married a woman named Eunice who kept books for the county extension office, and moved on to the family farm when his own father's health gave out in 1948. He brought his tools with him. Not all of them. The shop in Waterloo kept what was the shop's, but the ones he'd accumulated on his own. A 9-inch South Bend lathe he'd bought second-hand in 1946 for $60. A drill press from a school surplus sale in 1949. A set of Starrett micrometers in a wooden case, and a workbench he'd built himself from 2-inch oak planks on a welded steel frame, bolted to the concrete floor of the machine shed so it would not move. He said more than once that a workbench that moved was a workbench that lied to you. Harold Brandt did not hire work out if he could do it himself. This was not stubbornness, or not only stubbornness. It was arithmetic. He kept a ledger, a green canvas-covered composition book, in which he recorded every repair he'd made himself, alongside what the dealer would have charged. By 1961, that ledger showed $14,000 in avoided costs over 13 years of farming. He showed it to Nora when she was 17. He said, "This is what the farm actually costs, and this is what it would cost if I didn't know what I know. The difference is the farm." She understood what he meant. She never forgot it. Nora was the second of 3 children. Her older brother Carl left for Iowa State in 1959 and came back with an agronomy degree and a job offer from a seed company in Des Moines that he took without much hesitation. Her younger brother Gene left in 1963 and did not come back at all, ending up in Portland doing something with timber that nobody in Grundy County fully understood, which left Nora. She had been accepted at the University of Northern Iowa in the fall of 1961. She had a suitcase packed. She had a bus ticket purchased. She was 19 years old, and she had plans that did not include 240 acres of Grundy County black soil and a father whose hands were starting to shake when he tried to thread a bolt in cold weather. She did not leave. She didn't make a speech about it. She unpacked the suitcase, returned the bus ticket, and went back to work. She never spoke about it as a sacrifice. When people asked years later, she said she'd made a decision, and the decision had worked out, and she didn't see any point in talking about it further. Harold Brandt died in February of 1969. He was 61 years old. He died of a heart attack in the machine shed, which is where he would have chosen to die if he'd been given the choice, which he wasn't. He left Nora the farm, paid for. He left her the tools, paid for. He left her a savings account at the Grundy County State Bank with $8,400 in it, paid for. He left her the green ledger, which she kept in the same drawer of the same desk in the farmhouse kitchen, where he had always kept it, and which she continued in the same format he had established. Every repair, every avoided cost, every dollar the farm did not spend because she knew what she was doing. By the time she drove to that liquidation sale in October of 1974, Nora had been farming alone for 5 years. She had no mortgage. She had no equipment loans. She had no partners. Her brothers had offered at various points to help in various ways. She had thanked them and said she'd call if she needed anything. She didn't call. Now, the Oliver 88. When Nora Reinhardt looked at that tractor sitting in the mud at the Grundy Center liquidation sale, she didn't see what everyone else saw. What everyone else saw was a derelict, a parts machine at best, scrap iron at worst. What Nora saw was a frame in acceptable condition, a transmission she already knew was rebuildable, a rear axle that was sound, and a problem she had already spent 4 months solving before she ever raised her hand to bid. Because here is what nobody at that sale knew. 6 months earlier, in April of 1974, Nora had driven to a farm equipment salvage yard outside of Ames, a place called Hendrickson's, run by a man named Walt Hendrickson who bought dead equipment and sold it by the component. And she had paid $60 for a Continental F, 244 gasoline engine out of a dead skid loader. The Continental F244 was a 4-cylinder, 244 cubic inch engine producing approximately 60 horsepower. It was not the engine the Oliver 88 had been built around. The Oliver 88 had been built around its own proprietary engine, a 6-cylinder unit that was reliable when maintained and catastrophically expensive to rebuild when not. The engine in the tractor at the liquidation sale had been seized for years. The rebuild cost at the Grundy Center Oliver dealer in 1974 was $1,100 if you were lucky, and $1,400 if you weren't. Nora knew this because she had asked. She had also spent 2 evenings in March with Harold's engineering manuals and a yellow legal pad and a ruler, working through the dimensional compatibility between the Continental F244 and the Oliver 88 frame. Bell housing bolt pattern, crankshaft centerline height, PTO shaft alignment, transmission input bore diameter. She had made notes in the margins of the legal pad in her father's mechanical pencil, which she still used, the lead still the same hardness he'd preferred. She had concluded that the swap was possible with a fabricated adapter plate. She had sketched the adapter plate on graph paper, dimensioned it, and calculated the steel stock she'd need. She'd figured it out before she ever bid. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing impulse. They were watching execution. Let me tell you about the rebuild, because this is where Nora Reinhardt proved that the knowledge Harold Brandt had spent a lifetime accumulating was not buried with him. It was in the tools. It was in the workbench. It was in the green ledger, and now it was in her hands. She started in November of 1974, working evenings after chores and full days on Saturdays. The machine shed was cold. Harold had installed a small cast iron stove in the corner in 1955, and Nora kept it fed with split oak she'd cut the previous spring. The lathe was cold too, the first time she started it in years, the way stiff with old oil that had thickened in the Iowa November. She ran it empty for 20 minutes before she put a tool in it. The cutting oil reservoir on the drill press still had oil in it from the last time Harold had used it. She did not find this sad. She found it useful. She pulled the seized Oliver engine first, using the shop hoist Harold had built from pipe and chain in 1957. She set it aside. She would sell it for cores later. She got $35 for it in the spring from a rebuilder in Marshalltown who wanted the block. Then she assessed what was actually in front of her. The frame was solid. Surface rust on the sheet metal. Nothing structural. The transmission, once she pulled the inspection cover, showed wear on the second gear synchro and one bearing that needed replacement. But the gears themselves were good. The rear axle seals were weeping. The hydraulic system needed a full seal kit. The clutch was worn, but not destroyed. She ordered parts. Transmission bearings and seals came to $46 from a supplier in Des Moines. The clutch disc and pressure plate assembly was $28 from a farm parts warehouse in Waterloo that sold rebuilt units. The hydraulic seal kit was $8 from the Oliver dealer, who did not ask what she was putting it in. Rear axle seals, $6. She bought 2 used rear tires in serviceable condition from a tire dealer in Cedar Falls for $50 for the pair. The front tires she found at Hendrickson's in Ames on a second trip in December, $12 for both, mounted on rims that fit. The adapter plate was the critical piece. She machined it herself on Harold's South Bend lathe and finished the bolt pattern on the drill press. The steel stock, a piece of half-inch plate 12 inches by 14 inches, came from a steel supplier in Waterloo for $11. She spent 3 evenings on the lathe work and 1 full Saturday on the drill press, checking her dimensions against the graph paper sketch 4 times before she drilled the first hole. The plate fit on the first trial. She did not celebrate this. She set it down, made a note in the green ledger, and went inside to make supper. The Continental F244 needed a valve job and new rings. She did the valve work herself on the workbench, lapping the seats with the tool Harold had bought in 1952 that still had the original wooden handle. Engine rebuild parts, rings, bearings, gasket set, valve seals, came to $67 from an engine parts supplier in Iowa City. She assembled the engine on the workbench over 3 weekends in January and February, working by the light of 2 drop cords Harold had strung from the ceiling in 1961. Fuel system, electrical, and hardware, $31. She rewired the ignition herself using a wiring diagram she found in a Continental service manual she borrowed from the Iowa State Extension Library and photocopied for a dime a page. Here is what the 1952 Oliver 88 cost Nora Reinhardt in full. The tractor itself, $45. The Continental F244 engine, $60. Engine rebuild parts, $67. Transmission bearings and seals, $46. Clutch assembly, $28. Hydraulic seal kit, $8. Rear axle seals, $6. Adapter plate steel, $11. Rear tires, $50. Front tires, $12. Fuel, electrical, and hardware, $31. Miscellaneous fasteners and shop consumables, $9. Total, $373. The Oliver dealer in Grundy Center was selling a comparable rebuilt tractor in the spring of 1975 for $4,200. A new tractor of equivalent horsepower was $11,000. Nora Reinhardt had a working tractor, paid for $373. She did not tell anyone the number. She wrote it in the ledger. She put the ledger back in the drawer. The first time she ran the rebuilt tractor under load was the second week of April, 1975. She hitched it to a 4-bottom plow, a rig that her Oliver 88 had never been rated to pull in its original factory configuration, and that she had calculated the Continental F244 with its rebuilt rings and fresh valve seats could handle at a reasonable pace in Grundy County's black clay soil. She was right. The tractor pulled the 4-bottom at a walking pace down the south field, the exhaust note deep and steady, the ground turning cleanly behind it. Leroy Voss was plowing his own field on the other side of the fence line when he heard it. He heard the engine note first, different from the Oliver sound he'd heard from that farm for 20 years, deeper, a different cylinder count. And he stopped his own tractor and climbed down and walked to the fence. He stood there for a while, watching. When Nora came back up the field on the return pass, she stopped. Leroy Voss was 63 years old and had farmed the adjacent 180 acres since 1941. He was not a man who removed his cap often. He removed it. He rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the tractor for a long time. He said, "That's not the engine that came in that." She said it wasn't. He said, "What is it?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Harold would have done exactly that." She said she knew. He put his cap back on and went back to his own tractor. Word spread differently after that. Not the laughter of the feed store and the diner. Farmers telling other farmers something they had seen with their own eyes. Leroy Voss told 2 men at the co-op elevator. One of them told his son-in-law, who farmed 400 acres south of the county road. The Oliver dealer in Grundy Center heard about it by June and drove out himself to look. He stood in the machine shed for 20 minutes examining the adapter plate, running his thumb along the machined face of it, checking the bolt spacing. He said, "Who made this?" She said she did. He said, "On what?" She pointed at the South Bend lathe against the wall. He looked at the lathe. He looked at the plate. He looked at her. He didn't say anything else, but he told people about it. And the way he told it was not the way the feed store had told it. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone, watch the laughter travel from building to building and arrive back at the person it was aimed at and find nothing to attach to, stick with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling, because this one isn't over. The tractor was not the point. The tractor was how Nora Reinhardt proved to herself, and eventually to Grundy County, that Harold Brandt's arithmetic still worked. The real story is what she did with the money she didn't spend. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 11 years, because this is where the story stops being about a tractor and starts being about something else entirely. Nora farmed her 240 acres through the late 1970s with equipment she either rebuilt herself or bought outright for cash. She added a grain drill in 1976, a used unit she bought at an estate sale for $180 and rebuilt over one winter. She added a field cultivator in 1978, another estate sale purchase, $95, rebuilt. She kept the green ledger current. Every repair she made herself, she recorded against what the dealer would have charged. By 1978, the ledger showed avoided costs of $31,000, since Harold had started it in 1948, and $6,200 of that was Nora's own entry since 1969. She kept her operating costs low. She had no debt. Her seed and fertilizer were paid for at the start of each season, from the operating account she kept separate from savings. She lived in the farmhouse Harold and Eunice had built in 1951, which was paid for, and which needed maintenance she performed herself where she could, and hired out where she couldn't, paying cash. She put between $4,000 and $7,000 a year into savings throughout the 1970s. Not because she had a specific plan for it, because Harold had taught her that a paid-for farm needed a paid-for reserve, and that a reserve you couldn't name a purpose for was still a reserve, and that was enough. By the fall of 1981, Nora Reinhardt had $91,000 in savings. She was 38 years old. She had a paid-for farm, paid for equipment, no debt of any kind, and $91,000 in a savings account at the Grundy County State Bank. You know what happened next. You know what the 1980s did to farming in Iowa, and in every state that looked like Iowa. Interest rates climbed to 18% and stayed there. Corn dropped below $2 a bushel. Land values that had been climbing through the 1970s fell 40% in 3 years. Farmers who had borrowed against inflated land values to buy more land at inflated prices found themselves holding loans they could not service on income that had collapsed. The farm credit system, which had encouraged the borrowing, began calling loans. Banks that had written the mortgages began foreclosing. In Grundy County alone, between 1981 and 1986, 23 farm operations went through foreclosure or forced sale. 23 families, not because they were bad farmers, not because they were careless or lazy or ignorant, because they had built their operations on borrowed money at the exact moment that borrowed money became lethal. Leroy Voss's son, Dennis, lost the adjacent 180 acres in the spring of 1983. Dennis had borrowed $340,000 in 1979 to buy 2 additional parcels and a new tractor and a new combine. At 18%, the interest alone was $61,000 a year. When corn dropped to $1.85 a bushel, the math stopped working, and it stopped working completely, and the bank took the farm in March of 1983. Dennis Voss was 41 years old. Nora watched this happen from the other side of the fence line where his father had once stood, and watched her plow. She did not watch with satisfaction. She watched with the quiet sadness of someone who had seen the arithmetic coming for years and had been unable to make anyone else see it. Her own expenses didn't change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut because there had never been anything to inflate. Her tractor was paid for. Her equipment was paid for. Her land was paid for. Her operating costs in 1983 were within 12% of her operating costs in 1975. She had no loan payments. She had no interest accruing. She had $91,000 in savings, and it was still there, and it had grown. The Voss farm, the 180 acres that Dennis had lost, the same ground Leroy had farmed since 1941, the ground adjacent to Nora's south field, went to auction in September of 1983. The bank set an opening bid. A land speculator from Des Moines was there, a man in a sport coat, who had been at 3 other foreclosure auctions in Grundy County that summer. A farm management company had sent a representative. There were a few other bidders, locals who had somehow survived the first 2 years of the crisis, with enough credit remaining to consider a bid. Nora Reinhardt was there. She was wearing the same canvas work jacket she wore to every auction. She had a cashier's check in her coat pocket for $102,000, drawn on the Grundy County State Bank, which had taken her 20 minutes to arrange that morning. The bidding opened. The speculator from Des Moines bid. The farm management representative bid. One of the local men bid twice and stopped. The speculator bid again. Nora bid. The speculator looked at her. She looked at the auctioneer. The speculator bid. Nora bid. The speculator paused. A pause that meant he was calculating something. Credit line or carrying cost or resale margin, and in that pause Nora bid again, and the speculator did not come back. Gerald Foss, the same Gerald Foss who had called the Oliver 88 a project for someone with more ambition than sense 9 years earlier, said sold, and looked at Nora Reinhardt and said, payment. She reached into her coat pocket and held up the cashier's check. Gerald Foss looked at the check. He looked at her. He said, cash. She said, cashier's check is cash. He said, yes, ma'am, it is. The crowd went quiet, not polite quiet, not the quiet of people waiting for the next lot, the quiet of people rearranging everything they thought they knew about the woman standing in front of them, $102,000 in cash for 180 acres of Grundy County farmland, paid in full, at an auction where most of the people present were watching their own operations collapse under the weight of debt they could not service. The kind of quiet that happens when a community realizes, all at once and without warning, that someone they had laughed at 9 years ago at a liquidation sale had been right about something important, and had been right about it the entire time. Dale Reinhardt, her brother-in-law, the man who had said, "Nora, what in the world are you going to do with this thing?" was standing near the back of the crowd. He did not say anything. He looked at the ground for a while. Later that afternoon, he drove to the farm and found her in the machine shed, checking the hydraulic fluid on the Oliver 88, which was still running. He stood in the doorway. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "You don't owe me anything, Dale." He said, "I think I do." She said, "Then consider it paid." She handed him a wrench and pointed at a fitting on the hydraulic line that needed tightening, and he tightened it, and they didn't talk about it again. Nora Reinhardt farmed 420 acres through the rest of the 1980s and into the 1990s. The Voss ground was good ground. Leroy had kept it well, and Dennis had too, before the debt took it, and it responded to her management. She continued the ledger. She continued the savings habit. She rebuilt 2 more pieces of equipment in Harold's machine shed over the following decade, including a grain drill in 1987 that she converted from a worn-out unit she found at a farm dispersal sale for $40, and a field sprayer in 1991 that she built almost entirely from salvaged components for $280 total, at a time when a new comparable unit was $8,500. In 1996, at a county agricultural extension meeting in Grundy Center, Nora Reinhardt was asked to speak for 10 minutes about farm financial management. She was 53 years old. She stood at the front of the room and looked at the farmers in front of her, some of whom had been at the liquidation sale in 1974, some of whom had been at the foreclosure auction in 1983, some of whom were young enough that they knew both stories only by reputation. And she said the following. She said, "I want to tell you what I think the difference is between a farm that survives and a farm that doesn't. It's not the soil. It's not the weather. It's not the price of corn, though the price of corn will kill you if you let it. The difference is whether you own your operation or your operation owns you. A paid-for tractor and a paid-for farm are the only things a bank cannot take from you. Everything else is just borrowing time." She paused. She said, "My father kept a ledger of every repair he made himself and what it would have cost to hire out. When he died, that ledger showed $14,000 in avoided costs over 13 years. I've kept the same ledger since 1969. Mine shows $61,000. That $61,000 is sitting in the ground next door to where I've always farmed, and it belongs to me and nobody can take it." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then people started asking questions, and she answered them plainly and specifically for another 40 minutes. Harold Brandt's machine shed is still standing on the farm east of Grundy Center. The South Bend lathe is still there, bolted to the floor, the ways oiled and clean. The workbench is still there, still bolted to the concrete, still level. In 2001, Nora's niece Karen, Jean's daughter, who had come back from Portland at 22 and found that she preferred Iowa to Oregon and farming to anything else she'd tried, began spending time in that shed. She was learning the lathe. Nora stood behind her on Saturday mornings and corrected her grip on the cross-slide handle and told her to take lighter cuts than she thought she needed to and to measure twice before she cut once. Karen was a good student. She was also stubborn in a way that Nora recognized. The 1952 Oliver 88 with the Continental F244 engine is still on the property. It runs. It has been running with maintenance for nearly 50 years. The adapter plate Nora machined in the winter of 1974 is still in it. The bolt holes still true. The machined face still flat, to within the tolerance she held on Harold's South Bend lathe on a cold November evening when the county of Grundy, Iowa, was busy laughing at her. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at a broken-down tractor at a farm liquidation sale? Most people see junk. Most people see $45 thrown into the mud. Nora Reinhardt saw a frame, a transmission, an axle, and a problem she had already solved. The county saw a foolish woman making an impulsive purchase. They were watching a machinist's daughter execute a plan she'd been building for 6 months, with tools her father had paid for, toward a future she could already see clearly enough to sketch on graph paper $45, a seized Oliver 88, a Continental engine from a dead skid loader, a fabricated adapter plate machined on a South Bend lathe by a woman who had chosen a farm over a bus ticket and never once suggested she'd made the wrong choice. $373 total. And sitting in the ground beside it, eventually, 180 acres of Grundy County black soil that the bank had tried to sell to a speculator in a sport coat and couldn't because Nora Reinhardt had been keeping a ledger since 1969, and the ledger told the truth, and she had always preferred truth to comfort. That's the difference between someone who buys and someone who builds.